So we've seen other very promising signs that reintroduced oryx have acclimated to their novel environment, including observations of very large social groups, such as this group of 87 observed during an aerial spotting mission in November 2021. And we're also seeing an emerging seasonal movement highlighted here. So oryx moving longer distances toward the northwest from July through mid-September, and making more limited movements in the southeastern part of the reserve during the rest of the year. And we're seeing indications that Addax released into the reserve are also doing well. As of this month, the reintroduced Addax population is moving across an area of 14,000 square kilometers, shown in red here. Of 65 Addax released since 2020, 61 have been seen in the last year, indicating generally high survival. However, it's important to note that Addax released in 2020 were not fit with GPS collars due to the COVID-19 pandemic, so monitoring this release is difficult, and we only have collar data across a full seasonal cycle for the first 15 Addax. To investigate habitat preferences in more detail, we used a method called step selection functions. This is a kind of model that compares the characteristics of movements that a real animal made to characteristics of movements that the animal could have made but did not. So first, an animal's movements, usually recorded by a tracking technology like a GPS collar, is sampled at regular time intervals, and the exact interval depends on the species and the question of interest. Here, we're interested in general habitat preferences of a mammal that can move quite far each day, so we used a 4-hour interval. For each 4-hour step used by an oryx or Addax, we created 9 other steps where each animal could have moved based on step lengths and turning angles calculated from its movement data, and compare the characteristics of those steps that were used to those that were not used. And for anyone interested in a more formal description, this is case control logistic regression. To describe the characteristics of used and available steps, we included variables generally considered important to large herbivores moving through grasslands and savannas. We used 3 vegetation variables, all from MODIS satellite data, which capture vegetation greenness and productivity. So this is vegetation greenness and productivity closest in time to a step versus over the long term, which highlights tree and shrub cover, versus short-term change in vegetation, which highlights rapidly changing vegetation like annual grasses greening up after rains or senescing months later. We also included topographic variables, temperature, and we also wanted to consider non-environmental factors that could influence movement. So we included experience, the number of days since an animal was released, and group size, which could capture information sharing among group members and other social processes. And we calculated group size using the chain rule with the distance threshold of 200 meters. So we built multiple models for each species with different combinations of these variable types for the wet period of the year, July through September, and the dry period, January through June. So during dry periods, Oryx responded strongly and negatively to short-term change in vegetation productivity, which again highlights vegetation that's changing rapidly, like grasses that are senescing during this time, and generally preferred steps with higher elevation and low topographic roughness. However, when we look at interactions with other variable types, we see some really interesting trends. So more experienced Oryx have weaker preferences for topography and weaker preferences for temperature over time, indicating an increase in thermal tolerance. So from field observations and GPS collar data, we know that during dry periods, Oryx rest during the day and move primarily at night. And from this analysis, we can see that Oryx takes quite some time, about a year, to develop this behavioral strategy. And during the wet period, Oryx weakly preferred long-term vegetation productivity, which again is associated with trees and shrubs, prefer short-term vegetation productivity more strongly, and prefer both low elevation and high topographic roughness, which is consistent with interdunal depressions that often support trees and forage patches. So moving on to Addax, which show quite different habitat preferences. During dry periods, Addax responded negatively to long-term vegetation productivity and showed a weak preference for short-term productivity. And when we look at interactions with non-environmental factors, Addax took shorter steps during the dry periods as they gain experience, a weaker preference for current vegetation productivity, and start to change their response to respond negatively to long-term vegetation productivity. And we also see that larger groups of Addax showed substantially different habitat preferences during wet periods, including a negative response to long-term vegetation productivity and a strong preference for higher current vegetation productivity. So to sum this all up, among all models that we considered, those with all three types of variables, environment, experience, and social factors, performed the best for both species across all seasons. And there were key differences in habitat preferences between Oryx and Addax. Oryx primarily preferred long-term vegetation productivity, while Addax largely preferred short-term vegetation productivity. And Addax were more influenced by social factors, while experience influenced Oryx more strongly. And finally, I just have to note again that the Addax model includes a single release of 15 Addax, so additional data from animals released in 2021 will be really important to increase sample size and substantiate or not these results. And of course, the Oryx and Addax reintroductions in Chad are huge products with many important partners with whom this work would not be, without whom this work would not be possible. Thank you very much for your attention.